Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I'm going to talk about Trails of Cold Steel, which I know you're like, oh wow, color me surprised. But this is actually kind of a continuation of a previous conversation or topic I discussed fairly recently, where I talked about obviously news that it came out about what the Trails of Cold Steel anime was going to be. And obviously it got me thinking about certain things, and I'd actually kind of posited this question previously where I was like, oh, like they're doing this with the anime is kind of like an original story set in that universe. I mean, I'm sure it will tie in stuff from the actual game itself because it's taking place in Northumbria and it's subtitled Northern War, so it most likely will tie into the Northern War and stuff like. Well, my thinking was, prior to even finding out about that news, when I found out there actually was going to be a Trails of Cold Steel anime, it did kind of get me wondering, like, okay, it's like, how would they go about animating that? Like, I mean, once again, I am in a position where I've never watched a lot of animes that were adaptations of video games. I've seen a handful, like, I've seen Second Star Ocean anime. I've never played the game. I've seen bits and pieces of it. But I know, like, I don't know if they ever animated the second half of that story. I know the, like, 26 episodes at the time that I was aware of were like the first half of the game, and I've never seen the Persona games get adapted, and those are going to be important points going forward. But there's a lot in the Trails of Cold Steel games, and I'm like, how would you go about adapting that? Because it is a conversation of how much would you cut, how much would you keep, like the school life stuff. Like, I feel like a lot of it's important, but it's still like, how much would you cut? Like, how, I mean, would you rearrange certain story points? Like, when you cut away to like the Imperial Liberation Front stuff, like, would some of that not be as in order? Would you actually reveal some of that stuff more? Like, for example, when Gideon's using his flute to make the guardian of the Celtic, the park, when the guardian of that forest attacks you, like, would they show Gideon, or would they do what the game did and kind of not show you? Like, I mean, I'm curious about stuff like that. A lot of the political stuff, like, that kind of happens in the background, especially stuff with like Osborne and stuff. Would they like cut to that like more in the anime? Like, because obviously an adaptation, you know, isn't always a one-to-one, whether it is something going from like a comic book to a TV show or a movie. Like, you're always going to do your own thing with it. Like, that's the thing. Like, because I know like Persona animes aren't that long. They're like, what, maybe, at least I know like the P4 one was only like, what, 12 episodes or something like that. Those are like 100+ hour games. So I'm like, how much do you cut? Like, obviously you're cutting out a lot of the social link stuff and aspects of it. And so I'm sure you're just going plot, throwing in some little fun stuff here and there. So I'm assuming they do that, because obviously when I think of like Trails of Cold Steel, I think of the Persona games because of that whole school life element. Granted, it's not as day to day as Persona, because Persona is literally, you cover most of the year day by day, planning out what you're going to do. But Cold Steel kind of bounces around a little bit, but it is still a calendar to telling you like how much time has passed, and so on and so forth, so and so forth, you know. So like I said, I'd assume like if you include the field studies, you hit some of the like the keynotes, you probably get little tidbits here and there of their school life. I'm curious, like for example, like a field study, would you go like, okay, here's some of the random stuff, like montages of stuff they did, or you just kind of cut away from all the stuff they did after they arrived, and then you just do the main. I mean, I'm not saying like it's impossible, but it's just like, I can't see it in my head of just like how much you would end up cutting out. Especially because like the first game in particular is a lot of setup. In my head, I feel like 2, 3, and 4 seem a lot more doable adapting than the first one does, for whatever reason in my mind. Maybe that's like super people are like, no, you idiot, of course you could like easily adapt. It's just in my head, I feel like there's just so much in the first game that you'd have a hard time adapting. But then there's also something else that started crossing my mind too. I'm like, well, the later and later you get into the Cold Steel arc, especially 3 and 4, I mean, obviously it was there in 1 and 2, doesn't really fully pop up until like the end of 2, because you'll have all the stuff with Crossbell, but that's usually like very background stuff. It's mentioned here and there. Like if you adapted the second game, or the first or second game, like you could cut around some of the Crossbell stuff. But then you get into the third and fourth game and you're like, there's heavy connections to both the Liberal stuff and the Crossbell stuff. So it is a thing where I feel like you wouldn't be able to adapt the Cold Steel games without having to adapt everything else prior, because so much of that is I mean, I guess you still could, but there'd be so many characters you'd be like, wait, who's this character? Why are we supposed to, you know? It's kind of like how my experience with Lloyd, like when Lloyd and Risha pop up at the end of 2, that little segment before the epilogue, I'm like, who's Lloyd? who's Rishi? I'm like, oh, I guess these are just not realizing these are very key and important characters from the Crossbell game. So it just, I don't know how it's, and that gets more and more, without spoiling it for anyone that just never played them, but obviously, like, a lot of familiar faces pop up in the third and fourth game, so you're like, how do you, and they're not just like, oh, they're just like, yeah, make a cameo appearance. Like, no, they're pretty connected to the story, because like a lot of the Code Seal stuff, especially 4, wraps up a lot of arcs. Not just like the Erebonia arc, but also the Laburo arc and the Crossbell arc. But I mean, there's also still another game that obviously I haven't played, Hajimori no Kiseki, Trails, was it Into Reverie, or yeah, I think it's Trails Into Reverie, which is going to be like the English translated title. I think that in itself is more so a full-blown wrap-up of Code Steel, the Erebonia arc and the Crossbell arcs, while, you know, also being set up for future stuff like the Calvert arc that has already started. Tangents and all that aside, it's just like when you add in those elements, I just feel like we're just like, oh, you'd have to probably animate the other two, which I had previously mentioned. I know that there's at least an OVA or 2 for Trails in the Sky. Once again, I don't know how much of the story gets covered in that. They might be little one-offs, but I'm like, I think in my head, when I'm thinking of a Trails of Cold Steel anime, I'm thinking like they'd probably only give it like a couple episodes. Like, I think I'm treating it like it would be a Persona thing. I would think you'd have to go like maybe 52 episodes to like tell the entirety of like a Cold Steel 1, and then pretty much the same for the other game. Like, I think it'd be a fairly lengthy anime if you were to that. Now, if they were going to give it like the full-blown adaptation, I feel like that'd be at the very least, maybe a 200 plus. I mean, once again, depending on like what you cut and like how you can squeeze things in. I mean, maybe you could squeeze it down to a 26 or something per game. I don't know. That's just where my mind is. Like I said, that conversation about them, I'm wondering, is that why they specifically chose to do like kind of an original story in the universe? Once again, as you know, at the time there's like not too many details known about it, but I was thinking maybe like, yes, you could, I had brought it up previously, you'll see characters you'll recognize, but the reason why they probably won't do a full-blown adaptation is because you'd also have to adapt everything else prior, because it becomes so important to this story, because what happened before, I mean, because it's also, I mean, because the thing is, the games are designed where you could jump in at any point in time. Like, it helps having previous knowledge, especially with the Code Steel stuff. I learned that later on my first time playing through, but 1 and 2 you can get by pretty easily not knowing stuff. I mean, it's just like, oh, like you just, because especially 2, because like all the Crossbell stuff heavily influences what's happening in the Empire. I mean, not even just 2. It's like everything in 1 and 2 is heavily influenced by everything that's going on in the 2 Crossbell games. Because, for one, the stories are parallel, but also like we wouldn't be where we are in Erebonia if it wasn't for what went down in Laburo, especially like Ouroboros wise, you know? So it's like you could just easily throw a lot of that in there. So I mean, maybe they, because I'm like, you could, not unless they had just adapt the first game, but that's going to be the biggest tease ever, because you're just going to adapt the first game and just stop it there. You're like, no. Well, I mean, I'm sure there's some anime that probably just do that, but it's like, yeah, you don't get a proper conclusion until you get to 4. So once again, that's just my mind. Like, obviously, these are just kind of my thoughts. I'd love to get to know yours. Like, do you see, if you are a fan of the Trails of Cold Steel games, I hope that if you're coming across this, you are. Do you think it would be easy to adapt those games? Like, once again, do use examples you're aware of. Like, if you are aware, like, more so about like how Persona gets adapted, or even, I believe some of the Danganronpa games have gotten adapted. I think I know the first one did. I don't know if the others have as well, but how they translate getting adapted into anime, like, specifically, let's go with the Persona example because of the whole school life element. The whole Danganronpa thing, like, you can skate around that because, like, you know, so I think you could skirt around that. Like I said, I don't know how they handled it. I've still yet to watch the anime. I should at this point, you know. I do like those games. But regardless, I did also do that with Persona as well, because I like those games as well. But my point is, if you're more experienced with those getting adapted, like, how do you feel like that would translate to potentially a Trails of Cold Steel anime getting adapted? So I'm also sitting here thinking too, like, they probably wouldn't make it like 4 different series. They'd probably make it 4 different seasons. Every season covers a new game. Well, it also depends on like if they like how they want to divide it up like that. I don't know. Like I said, I'm rambling. Let me know your thoughts. Really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.